Good evening. Welcome to our webinar on Power Up Proficiency and Go Global. Those of you who are joining us have registered for our webinar tonight, and tonight is our first ever collab webinar with, let's see if I can get my slides to move. There we go. It's our first ever collab with the Minnesota Council on the Teaching of Languages and Cultures and langchat. I am Dawn Samples. I'm the director of More Learning at AVANT Assessment. More standing for More Opportunities Reaching Everyone. This is a new division at AVANT that we're trying to lift off the ground to help provide more professional learning opportunities for teachers and educators out in the field. So I have with me today our collaborative partners, Megan Budke, who is a Spanish teacher in Minnesota and the current president of MCTLC. There's Megan.
Hi, everyone.
We have Meredith White, who all of you langchatters out there, you know Meredith. Meredith is a Spanish teacher, and she is your langchat facilitator, administrator extraordinaire. Do you see it, Meredith? Can you hear us?
Yay, we can hear you.
And our surprise guest tonight is Linda Ignatz. And those of you who are familiar with ACTFL, Linda is currently now our Global SEAL Executive Director of the Global SEAL, also former, or still, I guess, ACTFL Toy. Linda is joining us from Chicago.
Hi.
So we're so glad to have everyone here. We're glad that you could join us. We are going to be doing the same format. A lot of people out there had some questions about how this was going to work. This is a collaborative effort that AVANT entered into with the Minnesota Council on the Teaching of Languages and Cultures to help promote professional learning for teachers. And we wanted to do something for free, and we also wanted to make it accessible to everyone. So we decided to see if langchat would partner with us so that we could have an ongoing learning online through langchat at the same time that we're doing our broadcast through the webinar. So if you were not able to join us tonight and you're watching this on Friday, you can share the link with anyone. It's going to be, a link will be on our More Learning website. You should have received a link to that in your notification for the webinar, and you will be able to join or share it with other people and watch the recording. Now, obviously, you guys can search #langchat on Twitter and follow along at any point. So, Meredith, if you would like to just kind of go over with our langchatters out there how this is going to work.
Absolutely. So when you participate, if this is your first time or you're going like, what is this langchat stuff? Participating on langchat is really simple, but there are a couple of critical parts. So when you quote unquote participate, you can do it in a couple of ways. You can kind of lurk and just watch the conversation, which is a recommendable option. But what we'd prefer is that you participate. And so that means that you are on Twitter. And when you are tweeting in response to the questions, as Dawn has the slide, it says, for example, question 1 will be Q1. The easiest way to follow that is to search langchat, #langchat, the $, and then langchat at the top of your Twitter screen, and then follow along and hit refresh and follow the tweets. Question 1 will be coded as Q1. And if you're wanting to show that you're responding to question 1, you'll not only put #langchat in your response, but you'll also put A1, which stands for answer 1. If that sounds like a lot and you don't want to hit refresh that many times and you're a little more Twitter savvy, or you just want a simplified version, you can also use tweetdeck.twitter.com, and you can just Google TweetDeck, like a deck of cards, and that will come up with your same Twitter credentials, and you can add a column and follow along that way. So when you're responding to a specific question, it'll be A1, which responds to Q1, meaning answer 1 for question 1, and then the #langchat. And hashtags are cool because they sort of thread the whole conversation together. So like right now we're live tweeting and saying, introduce yourself, who, you know, where are you from, what do you teach, etc. And responding with the #langchat threads it all together. So this is not only available to Twitter users, you can actually go to Twitter, not log in. I believe Melissa Kenny is asking a question about Twitter users. It's not only Twitter users. You can not have a Twitter username and still observe the conversation and access all the materials shared and everything. You just can't participate or respond. So you don't need a Twitter username, but it's awfully helpful. But if you just kind of want to stand back and be more observant, that's totally fine too. You just need to keep following #langchat and click most recent at the top, and you'll see our conversation sort of compiled that way. Anything I missed? What do you think, John? Did I miss anything?
I think so. I know one tip that I learned in following langchat that might just be helpful to think about is sometimes you get caught up reading something and responding, and then you don't realize that you need to scroll back up because the conversation has kept going and you kind of went off on a tangent over here. So if you're new to langchat, you might just remember, oh, I've got to get back up to the top and see, you know, if we've moved on to another question. Or the good thing about it is you can go back to it at any point. So that's always a plus about it being threaded on langchat. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you, Meredith. That's very helpful. And I hope we have a lot of new langchat participants out there tonight. That would be awesome. There's so many amazing resources that everyone's sharing with each other and just leaning on each other for support and ideas. So it's a really neat way to be able to collaborate with people who do what we do. So we don't always get to do that. And a lot of us are singletons out there who don't have people in our buildings to collaborate with. And langchat is right there, right at our fingertips. Okay, so we are going to move on to question 1. And question 1 is, don't know why my computer keeps going to sleep. There we go. Q1. So if you are in langchat world and just following along, the first question is, how does engagement look in each mode? And so the way we're going to do this tonight is each one of us is going to kind of take a question and respond, and then just have some discussion around that. And we're also going to be watching and monitoring your responses on langchat and kind of bringing them forward as well. I think this first question, Meredith, was going to let you kind of tackle this first one. What are 2 of your top strategies that are essential to your instruction and that keep your learners engaged? And the other part to that is, what impact does your classroom environment have on that? So
absolutely. And I believe, so I've got some images you'll see are a couple of screenshots of tweets, which will come after a second here. But Dawn's got this great slide that explains the modes. So before anybody explained the modes to me, I think I thought I knew what they meant, but I did not. And until somebody said, no, you're saying that wrong. That's when I realized that interpretive mode was in, interpersonal mode was together, and presentational was out. And so I actually kind of did hand motions with each of those, and I do them all the time with my students. And Nora Jones, a few years ago, who works she's in Virginia, she's a teacher, and Nora Jones is incredible, and she opened my mind to the everyday IPA. So one of my favorite strategies for student engagement is, of course, IPAs. You know, when you can fit them in, they're a lot of work and they're a lot to grade, but when you can fit in an integrated performance assessment, it's great. But the next step, I think, for me, was learning how to integrate that same structure into my everyday lesson planning. And it sounds like a lot more work, but it's really not, because it brings in things you're already using. You've already got audio files and reading, so there's your interpretive mode. You've got interpersonal, prompts and rubrics and all those kind of things, so for how students are interacting with you and with each other. And then the presentational mode is just speaking or writing, but without a response. And so for me, it was integrating those 3 modes together, and suddenly student engagement for me went through the roof when I went from one to the other, interpretive to interpersonal, and then to presentational. So like, we read something, now you're going to talk amongst each other about the thing we read. Now you're going to write or speak about not only the thing we read, but also what your peers said about the thing we read. And so this works great with infographics, and then some really nicely backward designed questions, and then some prompts that are pretty meaningful. And like I said, student engagement went through the roof, but also so did student investment. Because to be honest, before Nora Jones blew my mind at that particular school conference in her session with the concept of the everyday IPA, I was just kind of filling time. And I was doing okay. Like engagement was really average and it was fine. Rapport was really good, whatever. But I saw students really dig into what we were doing when they saw how it pieced together during an actual lesson. And I'm used to large classes, so this is 30 plus kids. I'm used to 36, that's my normal. So 36 kids a class, Spanish 1 and 2, 9 through 12 grades. That was my wheelhouse, and it still is. And so to get kids invested in what we're doing, they've got to see why it matters and also why it's interesting and what we've planned for them with intention and with them in mind. And so for me, those 3 modes really broke down what I was doing and why I was doing it. And it also shined, I don't know, let's make up a word. It put a light on, we'll just circle back you. It put a light on, it showed me what modes I was lacking in. Suddenly I realized I have a million things for them to read, but not enough audio clips. But my test sure had audio. So no wonder students were going like, oh my God, can you play it again? That was really fast. Well, I wasn't playing enough. They weren't listening to enough. They were listening to me, but not listening to other things enough. So as Dawn's got up on the screen there, you've got 4 different tweets. Feel free to, like, you can use Twitter as a search engine. You can search hashtag langchat and then just like any of that text that's typed, and you can find those tweets. You can even stick in my Twitter handle, and then Twitter functions basically like a little Twitter Google, and you can find the links to resources, pictures, etc. There are tons of resources out there that explain how people have integrated all the modes together in their lesson planning, but it really has taken advantage of all of the authentic resources I have. Suddenly now I'm able to like sort of parse out different audio recordings and infographics and cool things that I have for them to read and listen to, but I'm not overly heavy on one mode. It's got to be kind of evenly distributed, and I'm making sure my students are interpreting in a lot of ways, but also producing. And so for our program, that's really important. We know how language acquisition works, but we also know that results sometimes come in the form of what they're able to do and in terms of what other stakeholders are able to see. So that has proved really successful for me, and also really engaging for students. And they say so in their comments and in their surveys and their end of course, end of year evaluations. They don't feel like it's busy work, and they feel like the path through the modes is very clear, and that they're able to see their language goals, and they know why they're doing what they're doing. So that's been really successful for me.
And Meredith, let me just ask you a question real quick. I know that you've taken some risks and really done some exciting things with the classroom environment in your classroom, and what impact has that had on how students are engaging in those 3 modes?
I think it's been a lot of, I've had to really look at the environment piece, and like, for example, like on the TELL framework, if you're not familiar with the TELL framework, you can look up tellproject.org, TELL, like TELL, tell you a story. And so looking at environment, it's really made me figure out kind of like what are these language features that we're using, and what matters to whom? Whose stories are we telling? What's happening in our curriculum? But also like how are our students engaging in that piece, and how are they engaging in their own proficiency journey? If we're not using the language of proficiency in the classroom, well then it doesn't really make sense to later on say, oh well you're a novice high, or point them in the direction of various assessments like the AVANT pieces, and say, okay, now we're going to do this, if we've just been talking about the language and not in the language or speaking with the language of language. And so guiding them through the modes and also making them aware of their own progress, but also where they're going with the language of proficiency has been really empowering. And I think, again, made it feel like a journey, like a process, and shown kids what they're learning and also what the next step is, because ultimately we're preparing them for the next step.
Yeah, I like that. It's the way you describe that to me comes across as just being really transparent about that journey with the kids, and
Absolutely.
then walking
Absolutely.
that walk with you, and that it is a journey. It's not a one and done and then you move on to the next thing. It's a continuous learning.
It's not a race. Yeah, it's not a race, it's a journey. It's a trip, it's not a race. It's a camino, it's like the pilgrimages. It's not who gets there first. you're all going to get there at different time, and it's like popcorn. We all pop at different, all the kernels pop at different times. But
That's right. Yeah.
But your goals right now are, as Thomas Summer says, get them to intermediate, and intermediates motivate themselves, and intermediates start finding their own resources. But if they don't have the language for that, and again, they're one of 36 in a class, it's really easy to feel disenfranchised and like not get the personal attention, but that they feel like they need, and they do need. But with some intention in the planning, and with looking at the modes and going, okay, no, really, how am I teaching? Because I'm doing a lot of reading, but not a lot of listening, or a lot of writing, but not a lot of speaking. And no wonder my students aren't prepared, so that there's that reflection piece that I think is key for any kind of backward design and any kind of environment, really.
Well, thank you, Meredith. We are going to just take a look. We do have some people. Make sure if you are following along on the webinar, and you're also following along on langchat, make sure and check out some of the tweets. We've got some people who are sharing some of their responses on langchat. At ProfeTJ says, interpersonal engagement is students showing appropriate reactions, responding appropriately, and asking clarifying questions. We have Laura McClintock at LF McClintock. Students actively using the target language for interpersonal and presentational. Interpretive can be a little harder to gauge. I agree with what TH said about appropriate reactions. So make sure that you guys check out what's also being said. Your colleagues are contributing to the good things that Meredith also just shared with us. We're going to move on to our question 2 now. And question 2 is, how does student performance lead to proficiency in the classroom? So how does student performance lead to proficiency in the classroom? And this is actually, this is a question that I'm going to take for tonight. And I think that to simplify it really is to just say practice. Students are going to perform many times through practice, many times in each mode, with authentic text, with authentic realia, in authentic scenarios. I think it's really important for them also to have authentic tasks, which means that you're asking them to do something that is an authentic reason to communicate. So you want them to have to really want to know what the other person has to say or to share. So giving them opportunity for lots of practice. And I don't know if you see in the image here, those of you who are just following along on Twitter, what the first image is, it's a target practice, and none of the arrows have hit the target in any way. And you know what? That's okay. You don't stop there. You keep going, like Meredith was talking about. It's a journey. And over time, with lots of practice, you begin to get closer and closer to your target. And ultimately, at some point, you're going to reach your target. The thing with this journey is that it's also going to start back over again. Maybe your target was novice high for a course, and when you move into the next course or you reach novice high, you reset your targets and you start that practice or continue that practice and make it ongoing. I think that in a language classroom, we have summative IPAs, but really almost every form of assessment in language is formative, because I don't know that we ever really get there. Even in our L1, I don't know that we ever really get to this final destination. There's always improvement that we can be working towards. I think it's also important that it's not always the teacher talking. Going back to the engagement piece that Meredith was just talking about, the students have to have lots of time to practice, which means they have to have voice. They have to have opportunity to write, to read, to speak, to interact with each other, and with in as many cases as possible with authentic texts and realia, so that they're building confidence that they can actually do something in the language. But they also are, when they do that, they begin to build and scaffold their language, which is going to broaden what they can do in the language. And when they start to be able to sustain what they're doing in the language with consistency, that's going to build that proficiency. So it's about the performances. I think it's important to know the difference a little bit between performance and proficiency, and we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. But those performances in your classroom, over and over and over, practicing in those scenarios where they're able to perform, is going to build a foundation that leads towards that proficiency. And so that's really, really important. Engagement is really the key. Practice is the key. And the other night on langchat, this is a tweet from the other night that I had said high anxiety equals a high affective filter. This is something that I believe as a learner myself, but also as a parent of a language learner, or two of them, and just learning in general. If you have really high anxiety, the learning stops. And so our jobs as teachers is to make that language comprehensible, make it within their grasp where they can manipulate with it, and to practice without penalty. I think the without penalty part is so important, because the minute we start to give them a grade on practice, it becomes an assessment. And that practice just needs to be an ongoing, I can practice, I can make mistakes, I can say something that totally didn't make sense, I can learn to laugh at myself. I don't know if you can learn another language and not laugh at yourself. I think we've all had those stories. So practice without penalty means they're allowed to learn from those mistakes and not be penalized for them. That's going to encourage them to be risk takers for you in your classroom. And it's going to let them start to step out and try to do something with language they've never done before, which, as we all know, is going to move them up on that proficiency scale. So practice without penalty is just essential, and lots and lots and lots of practice. So those are some of the things, at least that's my take on question 2. Let's look real quick before we move on to just a few of you who are making some comments out there, you langchatters out there. At Profi Global South Carolina, or SC, I agree with practice. We always start out with thinking out loud, then writing, then practicing with a crutch, but not full sentences, and lastly, cutting loose. Practice until it's muscle memory, but in a variety of authentic contexts. Yes. We have performances or practice in controlled situations. Get enough practice and you can learn to survive and thrive in the real world where it counts, which is proficiency. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, so we are going to move on now to question 3. And question 3 is going to be for Megan. Megan, you are up for question 3. Question 3 is, before, between, and after assessments, how are students receiving feedback to guide them towards their goals?
All right, so feedback can be really challenging. You know, just thinking about like how much, how often, what does it look like in each mode? So when I think about feedback, I kind of have 3 things that I kind of keep in mind. And the first thing I think about is what is going to be the feedback that really grows students' proficiency. Many years ago, but I think it's still on the actual virtual learning modules, they ran a webinar that talked about like what does feedback, effective feedback, really look like in a world language classroom. And they talked about there were 4 things. And so they said the 4 things that actually push students to the next proficiency level would be that students could narrate, that they could elaborate and support, that they can sustain a conversation, and that there's risk taking. And so when I think about those 4 things, I try really hard to make my feedback focus on performance indicators, and I connect them with actual rubrics. So to me, something like risk taking in my classroom, I can see really easily at when students do language creation, because they're taking a risk, putting those words together in a new way, rather than constantly just reciting memorized language off the vocab list. The ideas of narrating, elaborating, and supporting, those to me connect directly to text type. What kind of text types are the students using? Words, phrases, sentences, and then also impact. What are the details they're going to use to create rich details and really maintain the attention of their audience? And then when you think about how do you sustain a conversation, that's directly related to communication strategies. How well are they communicating to have that conversation? So the first thing I think about when I think about feedback is what are going to be the things I can do? What are going to be the things I can focus on that actually are going to grow their proficiency? And then don't worry about the other things. They don't need feedback on those things. That's not going to grow their proficiency. I really want to hone in on what's actually going to have an effect for them. The second thing I think about comes from a quote from Greg Duncan, but it's kind of highly related to research. So Greg has said at one time that descriptive feedback lets students know how they did in the context of what was expected. And it always includes an opportunity for the learner to think through what they did to make the product better. And this fits with the research in that we really shouldn't just be telling our students what they should do, but actually give them an opportunity to think about what they should do. So that to me relates a lot to questions. How can I give my students questions about what they can do to grow? And then the third thing I think about when I think about feedback is I am one person and I teach, and just like many of you, you teach, 100, 200, 300, sometimes 600 students. And so how do I find ways to empower students to actually take control of their own path to proficiency? And what resources do I have that I can give them so they can provide themselves feedback and kind of understand where they are on the pathway, so I can be very much more like a coach. I know, Linda, you've talked about that before. How do we coach our students on the path to proficiency rather than them looking at me as being the sole provider of their feedback? So all three of those things considered, on the screen, what you see is just some ways we could give feedback in different modes. So when I think about the interpretive mode, I tend to use the actual interpretive IPA template. I like that because it just guides students through a series of research-based tasks that really lead students to understand the message of the text. And students then, they can complete the template. I provide answer keys in my classroom. They assess themselves, and then I actually have them score themselves on the rubric so they can really see where are they on each part. And then for me, in terms of feedback, as they are turning this in, I'm just having a really brief 1-minute conversation about what went well and what is one thing to work on. And kind of while we're talking, I might spot check a couple things to see if I agree, or if there's something else, I just push them again on. So that's one way I might do it in the interpretive mode. One of the other images you see on there, for the interpersonal mode, you see a scoring guide. That is from Paul Sandruck and Donna Clementi. They presented it at ACTFL 2018. And I love this scoring guide because I literally can just print copies of this guide and just distribute it anytime I do an interpersonal activity. So I don't have to plan ahead, like, how can my students get feedback on the interpersonal mode? I just have a set of these ready to go when it's like, okay, let's check in and evaluate, like, how are we doing on being a positive partner? Because that's a very important part of having interpersonal conversations. And this works for any interpersonal conversation I do. And I like this because interpersonal can be really hard for me as a teacher to give feedback in the moment because they're all talking at the same time. So for me to go around and spot check, it takes a lot. It's difficult for me unless I'm sitting down one-on-one or maybe with a pair of students. So this way, when it's printed for them, they can easily see what are the expectations and how do I be a positive partner? And then they've got them in front of them every time they have a conversation, and they can rate themselves in different conversations and say, okay, here's what I'm doing well. Here's an area I could grow in. So that's one I really like to use a lot. And then in the presentational mode, I love my glow and grow forms. I use them a lot. I got this great idea from Stephanie Carbonneau. You can find her on Twitter at Madam Carbonneau. And she kind of gave this idea of, and I expanded on it. So when my students do a presentational piece of work, whether it is practice or assessment, I often will have them grab 3 markers, and with one color, they will just circle what their language creations are. With another color, they will underline the rich details they have in their work. And then with another color, they're going to put parentheses around any strings of sentences. So then after they do that, and you can see kind of the color-coded copy, it's a great visual for them to see what's there. It's also really great for me when I'm grading or trying to give feedback, like what's there. I can see it very clearly. They use that to then fill out a glow and grow form. So they reflect on how they did on language creations, how they did on text type, how they did on impact, which were the 3 they used their colors on. And so they reflect on what is one thing they are glowing for each of those areas, and where's an area they could grow in each of those areas. And then on the back, there's kind of some statements in the form of questions, because Greg Duncan says use questions, about what they might consider for ideas for glowing and growing if they're not sure, just from reading the rubric there. And then once they've done that, they've used colors, they've reflected on glow and grow, then they get that rubric and they actually will rate themselves on the rubric where they think they are. And then I can take that and put my own marks on top of that so we can see if we match. And then I can just kind of write comments about what I agree and what's a strength, or, yep, I agree, this is an area you could really push yourself next time. Or especially if I see that we have differences, then I might take more time to write a comment about, you know, I see you thought you had strings, but what I see is more sentences. How could you consider, you know, writing multiple sentences on the same topic to really create strings of sentences? So that leads me to give feedback that focuses on the rubric. It also helps give me input on where they think they are on the path to proficiency, and just give them some feedback that really can work with where they're at and also where they want to go. So those are 3 ways I try to base my feedback on different areas of the rubric to help grow their proficiency, using rubric indicators to give feedback, but also providing questions so they can have opportunities to think about how they might grow differently, but then also just being intentional about what are the resources I could provide so that they could really take control of their own learning, and kind of continue on that path to proficiency.
So Megan, one of the things I just want to comment on that you said that I think is so powerful, and the things that you described, the examples you gave are so awesome. I can just hear now, we may just have to post this, not just the webinar, but also these slides up for people so they can grab them, because everyone's going to be wanting to look at these, is that the students really are owning and self-assessing. They're owning their own progress. They're using the descriptors themselves to figure out where they are. They're giving each other feedback. Like they really are part of that process for their own growth in the language. Was it hard for you to get them acclimated to speaking that language of proficiency?
Interesting that you say that. So I teach middle school. I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And I use the actual produced rubrics, which are very wordy. And when people look at them, they always are like, well, those are very student friendly. And I would say, yes, you're right, they're not. So things that I do to help them, because even though they're not student friendly, doesn't mean we can't go through and have a conversation about what are those indicators really talking about. So I use the rubrics as is. And then what we do before every assessment, well, actually, I'm going to back up. One thing I do, a great idea I learned from Kara Parker at Creative Language class, is I actually have the rubric on my wall. So I have what it means to be novice low, novice mid, novice high, intermediate low. That's the proficiency level my students are at. So anytime we do an activity, you know, I can walk over to that wall and say, to meet expectations, I should hear you using sentences and phrases. How could we make strings of sentences with this activity? So that's a quick reference that I can always do anytime I'm in my classroom. And then the other thing we do is every time we do an assessment, we pull out that rubric and we go through the meet strong and the exceeds level for them. We don't worry about the other ones because we want them to be meet strong or exceeds. So for them, that's novice high and intermediate low. And we actually go through, as me as a teacher and my students, we highlight what are the key indicators in each one. So they're not reading the whole lengthy description. We're just highlighting. In language function, you're either completing it with memorized language with some attempts to create, or you're creating more consistently with the language by combining and recombining different elements. And we talk about what does it mean to have memorized language versus creation. We'll take a minute to brainstorm. What does a language creation look like? You know how to say to practice sports. You know how to say to watch TV. Could you put them together and say, I like to watch sports. Now you're taking memorized language, but you're combining it in a new way. And could you do that multiple times? So it can be done. And I say that it can be done because my sixth graders can do it. And by the end of sixth grade, when we give our last assessment, I often will just give them the meet strong descriptors. And I say, now tell me, what are the exceeds descriptors? Because we know them by now. And it's just really fun to see, like, it takes many conversations, and referring to that rubric on the wall, but they can get there and they can do it if you're just really intentional about how you
practice. It's part of the practice, not just in the language, but the practice of understanding the path that they're on, and how they're going to get there. Yeah. I love that. I think there's so much power to that. And to just draw a connection with something Meredith said that you also said, both of you made the point that you have to not look at everything at once. You have to really narrow your focus down for what you're wanting and expecting the kids to do for that task in that moment, and let go of the other.
The rest of it.
And that way they're getting the feedback they're getting is very focused and intentional around what you ask them to focus on. And Meredith mentioned the same thing in each of the three modes. And I would even take it a step further for us as practitioners to have grace with ourselves, that we also have to narrow our focus to taking on projects and new initiatives and new ways of doing this in little baby steps. Your Meredith chiming in.
Amen.
It is really hard to think of the paradigm shift and making that shift happen really quickly. It doesn't happen quickly. And so I think that all of that applies to becoming proficient at something. So keeping that parallel in mind for ourselves too, not just for our kids, I think is important.
I think too, and for our colleagues, I think we'd be remiss not to mention that our kids don't just exist for us. I'm in a department of 14. And so if I neglect or ignore the fact that my students move on to someone else, and usually several someone else's, if I haven't prepared them in the way that's expected, in the different modes, that's appropriate, I'm setting my students up for failure. And now they're going to question the experience that we had together because level such and such is way too hard and whatever. So it really kind of, when you look at what they're actually able to do and how we've empowered them to give them the language to be able to not only do it, but also express that they can do it. Right. And they know what's level appropriate, and they know what's expected of them in the next level and why that's level appropriate. And then they've been given up, like Megan said, they've been given the level up language to be able to go, okay, I can do that. I can make something more original. I can combine sentences. Now your colleagues are going, hey, wow, these kids are really taking risks. Like, they're doing really awesome, instead of, oh, they don't know X or they don't know Y. And that's an all too common conversation, I think.
They're inheriting kids who are self-initiating and becoming independent learners. And what a gift we can give our colleagues. Right?
Absolutely.
Yes. So we are going to move on to our next question now. I do want to just point out one of the tweets that I just saw. That's by @SeñoritaGray016. Formative assessments are not just for teachers. Teach students how to read their own data and create goals off of them. Use them to give them feedback. Yes. Okay, so we're going to move on to question 4. And question 4 is, how do we know in terms of proficiency how well students are doing? How do we know in terms of proficiency how well students are doing? And this one is actually a question for me. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about understanding the difference in performance versus proficiency. If we're trying to understand how well our kids are in proficiency, we have to first understand where they are in their performance. So the easiest way, I think, to explain that, and many of you already know this, but for those of you who may not, when we are measuring a performance in an assessment or in a task in our classroom, we are measuring something that we have taught to the learners. We have taught them to practice these skills. When we are measuring proficiency, that is a measure of how well someone can communicate in the language. And it doesn't really matter where they learned it. It doesn't matter who taught it to them. They could bring it with them to class from an experience they've had with family, abroad, with a neighbor. They may be able to do things that they own as part of their language proficiency because they have owned it and can communicate it no matter how, no matter what scenario. In performance, students are actually performing within sort of a protected umbrella of what's just been taught to them. So to refer back to what I was talking about earlier about practice without penalty and practice in authentic ways, in authentic contexts, in authentic tasks, that's so important, because the more authentic the opportunities and the scenarios they have to practice in, the more that's going to become part of what they own in the language, which is going to build that foundation and work towards proficiency. Proficiency is when they can maintain a certain level of communication consistently. And they may not even know what you're going to ask them. They can respond to a certain level. So there's a difference. Performance is really sort of like classroom-based assessment. Proficiency is, I don't know what you're going to ask me. This is language that I own, that I know how to use to the best of my ability to this level consistently. So if that kind of makes sense, they are two pieces to a whole, because even when we are learning language, say from our grandmother at home, we still have to practice that language with her to learn the language. It doesn't just come to us. That's the learning scenario for the student. So practice and many performances lead to proficiency. So programs that have structures in place that support student learning, where they have the opportunity to perform and get feedback and move forward in that kind of context, typically have higher results in proficiency. Does that make sense? So the other piece to that is, so let's say, like Megan was talking about earlier, she has a rubric and she gives them feedback, and they know on that rubric where they fall and where the next level is. So one of the ways that we also are able to look at where they are and what the next level is through a third-party assessment. Obviously, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of them would be maybe the STAMP assessment, which is a measure of proficiency. It is not a performance assessment. And I think that's something that's really important to know. When you're looking at measures of proficiency, we may not have any idea what the student is going to be asked on a proficiency test. And that's okay, because if a student is going to leave and go visit the country where the language is spoken that they've been studying, the people there are not going to know the other half of the conversation they've been practicing in class, right? The people there could ask them anything, and how well they can communicate with that person is their level of proficiency. So on a proficiency assessment, the STAMP test is a test that measures 4 skills. It's a standards-based measurement of proficiency. It's going to give students opportunities to show what they can do across a myriad of contexts. It's an adaptive test where students are going to be prompted, and depending on how well they respond, it's going to prompt them up, or it's going to prompt them lower or higher on the proficiency scale against the actual descriptors. So that's just important to know, because that's feedback for us. If my concept of what novice high is something that has sort of become my own personal concept of novice high, well, novice high is novice high. According to the actual descriptors, it is novice high. It doesn't matter if it's Linda's version of novice high and Megan's version of novice high and Dawn's version of novice high. If they're not all the same thing, like Meredith said earlier, we have a problem, because then when we move students forward and we're telling them, you are intermediate mid and you are going to rock that class next year, and then they get there and that teacher is like, you are novice mid and this is not what I expect of you, that's a problem. So an external third-party assessment is helpful because it helps us calibrate and understand where they really are versus where we think they are, and helps us set goals to know where we need to take them next. So that is one way to know how well students are doing, as a third-party assessment that is standardized, and that is feedback and data that you're going to get that you can know is going to be aligned with the actual levels. So that's sort of the difference between performance and proficiency. They are completely related. They work together and are intertwined together, but they are a little different. So I don't know, let me just see before we move on. So we have at C_Yazzie who's saying proficiency versus performance, so hard to grade. We as teachers teach the language, then they take the language and make it their own. Yes, and it is hard. We can give them ratings or scores against those descriptors, the actual descriptors, and tell them where they performed on the actual scale in that performance, but that doesn't mean that that's necessarily their level of proficiency. It means that's how well they can perform in that context. Can they still perform that well and take it out of that context? That's proficiency. Let me see. We are going to move right along in just a second. Actually, we are going to move right along right now because it is time for our special invited guest, Linda. We're so happy you could join us tonight and help us with this last question, because this is your area of expertise. How do we validate students' achievement?
Well, I think this is the most exciting part of the whole set of questions, because this is the reward part. This is what students want to know. And in the past, it was sort of like, what grade did I get? But the difficulty for students, especially students that I had oftentimes, was that at the end of maybe the first semester, they were getting a B, and at the end of second semester, they were still getting a B, and they didn't think they got any better. And they did. They were doing more, they could with the language, but as far as they were concerned, that if their grade didn't get any better, then they didn't learn any more, and they weren't any better. And oftentimes that's why students drop your class, is because they don't think that in their mind, getting better at something means that my grade goes up. And so we really need to look at ways to help them celebrate their journey on their pathway. And so I really wanted to start with these images. These are all Global Seal of Biliteracy recipients, and they're all different ages. So we have some middle school students, we have some high school students, we have a college student, and we have an adult. And every one of these Global Seal recipients all got their Global Seals at intermediate mid, which is our first level of recognition at what we call functional fluency. Because intermediate mid, which is the most popular level of award for the state seals of biliteracy, is that first space on the proficiency pathway where an individual is actually functionally independent. It won't be pretty, but they can actually get by independently if they're with what we refer to as a sympathetic native speaker. But they can actually do some things in the workplace, that some simple tasks. And so what's oftentimes a dilemma for me is that when we give us, for example, if we just give that certificate at this particular level, the message that we give is that you have a seal of biliteracy. So it sounds like you've won the race, that you've finished. And I'm going to have Dawn kind of forward that slide to look at the whole pathway. And if we look at intermediate mid, we still have in our sort of realm of K through 16, 4 more levels, but there's still superior and distinguished beyond that. And so we have, as language learners and even as language educators, we probably have some more spaces on our own language proficiency pathway where we could explore. And so really that's what the Global Seal of Biliteracy does. So rather than have a singular award, we actually are celebrating the pathway. So we have 3 levels of awards, and we believe that when you get to that level, we want to celebrate it. And so we begin at that first level where you are functionally a bilingual. It won't be, again, you can't do an awful lot yet, but you can function independently at intermediate mid. And then we give a secondary, our next level award at working fluency, which and again, we use that word fluency because that's the word that the workplace uses. No one's ever, in the workplace come up to you and asked you are you an advanced low? But if they hear that you speak a language, they'll often say, well, are you fluent? That's the first question that I get asked. But as a language teacher, I know all the things that I don't know in the L2 or maybe the L3 that I'm working on. And so I'm hesitant to own that, because I know that there's levels of language acquisition. And so that's what we've really tried to do with this fluency term, is we've tried to sort of give maybe that ACTFL scale, but in a way that's user-friendly to the the rest of the non-academic space. And so working fluency as an advanced low, and then we just added our professional fluency at advanced high. And what we've done is really created a pathway that not only your learners can be on, but you as a language educator can join in on and set the example of leveling up. And that's taking advantage of that sort of 21st century gamification and really helping learners take autonomy over their language pathway. Because if we share the rubrics, as you've heard Megan talk about, and really help students understand what is the proficiency pathway look like and what is it that I have to do to get to the next level, and then begin to help them and coach them to do those specific tasks that are going to help them to really level up, then as soon as they get to that level, let's celebrate and give them then the tools to get to the next level. And what we have seen with that concept is that students are really excited about it, and they want to then find out, well, what were my test scores? What did I get in listening or in reading? And when you provide a 4-skill test, for example, the Apple or the AVANT Assessment stamp that Dawn was talking about, when you give one of those skill tests that gives 4 different scores, very few students are going to have the exact same score in all 4 categories. In fact, they're going to find out that they have a strength. Usually it's a reading score that might be 1 or 2 levels even above their lower score. And they're going to get really excited because by the time they get to intermediate mid and all 4 scores, they might already be at advanced low in their reading, which is really exciting because then they can say, wow, I'm already there. So I think I'm going to work and keep on and maybe bring up my other scores because I can start to get closer to that next level. And what we see happening, and we see this in the data with the state seal of biliteracies that have happened, is that our retention goes up in upper levels. In fact, the average is about 30% increase. AP numbers seem to double. And so what we're really excited with that global seal is the idea that we can provide that. And so we do see some exciting things happening, not only in middle schools, but in high schools and in universities, and even into the adults. In fact, about 25% of our awards right now are going to universities and adults. So I encourage you, if you want to find out some more, to go to theglobalseal.com, check out our website. You can there's some questions, some frequently asked questions there, and I don't know if we have time or if you've popped up any questions, but we have time to answer those here. But I want to, but we're really excited to share how we can do that. But again, it's an external test similar to what you might see with the seal of biliteracy, but you can do that as soon as your students are ready and then get them excited about leveling up.
Well, and Linda, can you also maybe talk about some of the feedback you've gotten where teachers have taken the global seal and how they have been modeling that pathway for their students?
Yeah, that's been probably one of the most exciting pieces, and really what's prompted the addition of some of that professional fluency level is that teachers oftentimes haven't sometimes ever been tested. I never had to take a test when I got my teacher certification because, well, it was a very long time ago. And a lot of times you maybe haven't taken a test, maybe you took an OPI, but you never had to take a writing test. And so a lot of teachers aren't even aware of their own level of proficiency.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of a challenge, take it on and find out what your level of fluency is and set the example for your students. And what's really exciting about that then is then you become that role model for them. Or maybe maybe you're practicing another language and you're learning another language, and you can be able to sort of share that experience alongside of your students. And so there is this journey. And again, if you're at advanced low, maybe when you were studying abroad or when you got your teacher license, where are you now? Because there's still superior and distinguished to go. So we've got an award for you. So don't let your students take all the awards. Set the example.
You can take one home too.
Yeah.
So you guys make sure you check out the website. And like I said, I'll also post this this PowerPoint online as well. It is time. I can't even believe this hour is almost over. It's gone so fast. Langchat always goes fast. So I know that Meredith has already posted on Langchat what are your takeaways. So if you will, you can post your hashtag langchatTA so that we can kind of follow up what some of your takeaways are. If you have any ideas or resources or materials that relate to what we talked about in the webinar tonight, please share. We would love to see those threaded through the Langchat. I do have just a couple of things I want to make sure that everyone's aware of. As I was telling you earlier, the More Learning division of professional learning at AVANT, we have new professional learning resources and supports that we're putting into place to kind of help support that whole ecosystem of proficiency so that people who use AVANT Assessment products like the stamp test, when they get that data back, it's not always just the data to either get the seal of biliteracy or the global seal. It's how can we use this data to really leverage what's working in our program, what's maybe areas we need to work on, how are we calibrating, how we're rating students, how are we looking and using that data to make wise instructional decisions around curriculum, instructional practices, strategies. So we're trying to provide more and more professional learning and coaching around that. We're putting together a whole team of More Learning team members. You'll be hearing about that more. We're going to be having some upcoming blogs. We're going to be introducing some of our More team members through the blogs, and we may be reaching out to you if you have a story to share about how being a bilingual or biliterate or highly proficient or language learner in general, how that has impacted you in your life or in your profession. We want to be able to talk about the things you're doing in your classrooms and just highlight those things. We're also going to be doing more and more webinars. So be looking for that. We'll be announcing some more information about that soon. And there's also a summer opportunity for professional learning with the NICE conference that Amanda Seawald has been working on. It's going to be for immersion teachers this summer in Spain. And AVANT Assessment is going to offer scholarships for 10 teachers to attend. The scholarship would fund the tuition and the registration. So if you're interested in that, be sure to keep tabs on our website. You can email us at morelearning@avantassessment.com. Check out our webpage. And just know that we're trying to meet the needs of our teacher learners and our language learners. And so we want to do as much as we can to broaden our supports and to support you guys out there. We have 1 minute left. I just want to say thank you so much to Megan and MCTLC for partnering and asking us to partner with you guys to do this webinar, and to Langchat. Meredith, thank you so much for letting Langchat partner with us too, so we could reach as many people as possible and just get some information out and collect information from our teachers out there in the field. So Linda, thank you for giving us your time tonight too. I really appreciate it. It's been so much fun, you guys. And I hope that we can do this again. That would be awesome. So that's all our time for tonight. I feel like the evening news. I'm signing off. That's all our time for tonight. I'm Dawn Samples from More Learning at AVANT Assessment. See, I should not be a newscaster. So we're going to let you guys go. Have a great evening and look for the recording online at our website so you can share with others. Thanks. Bye-bye.